I have to tell this story because keeping it inside feels like its own kind of prison. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth of what happened when I was 66 years old and how I took back my life. The crystal champagne flute felt ridiculously delicate in my hand, a hummingbird's bone against the calloused fingers of a retired history teacher. I was standing in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel Boston, a world of glittering chandeliers and hushed, expensive chatter. We were there, 100 of us, for the annual Thorne and Sterling Capital Client Appreciation Gala. Our host, Julian Thorne, the man I'd entrusted with my entire life savings, stood on the stage, his smile as bright and empty as the room was full. He raised his own glass, the light catching the absurdly expensive watch on his wrist, and in the very first words of his toast, he exposed the rot at the heart of it all. To our clients, he began, his voice smooth as polished marble, especially those with the wisdom of age, who know when to trust the instincts of a new generation. The condescension was so subtle, so perfectly wrapped in a compliment, that most people just smiled and nodded. But I felt a sudden, icy chill crawl up my spine. He wasn't toasting us, he was mocking us. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The next morning, the chill was still there. I'd been a history teacher at Boston Latin for 40 years. I wasn't just a teacher, I was a historian. I understood patterns, the slow erosion of empires, the subtle shifts in power that precede a collapse. Julian's words were a tremor, a warning sign. My wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 5 years, and the $1.2 million pension we'd so carefully built was all I had left of our shared dream. It was our security, our promise of a quiet life filled with books, travel, and maybe a small cottage on the Cape. It was everything. I had moved it to Julian's firm 2 years prior, on the glowing recommendation of a former colleague who'd been dazzled by Julian's charm. I'd been dazzled too. He was young, sharp, dressed in bespoke suits that probably cost more than my first car. He'd sat in my Beacon Hill brownstone, the one Eleanor and I had bought in the 70s, and he'd spoken of conservative growth, of capital preservation, of being a steward for my legacy. He'd looked me in the eye and promised to treat my life's work with the respect it deserved. That morning, a gray Tuesday in October, I sat down at the antique mahogany desk where Eleanor used to pay our bills. I brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma usually a comfort, now just a bitter smell in the air. My hands trembled slightly as I typed in the web address for Thorne and Sterling's client portal. I entered my username, my password, and clicked login. The page loaded, the familiar navy and gold logo spinning for a moment. And then my portfolio summary appeared. My heart didn't just drop, it vaporized. The numbers, the columns, the pie charts, they were all gone. In the place where the 7-figure sum of my life should have been, there was only one stark, brutal figure. Total account value, $0. I stared at it, convinced it was a glitch, a technical error. It had to be. I refreshed the page. $0. I refreshed it again, my finger stabbing the F5 key. $0. The number didn't change. It was an epitaph. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, and I felt a pressure in my chest so intense I thought my ribs would crack. I called Julian's private line. It went straight to his voicemail, his cheerful, confident voice a ghostly echo from a world that had ceased to exist moments before. "Arthur, good to hear from you. Leave a message, I'll get right back." I didn't leave a message. I grabbed my coat and walked the 12 blocks from Beacon Hill to the financial district, the crisp autumn air feeling like a shroud. The city I had loved my whole life felt alien, its familiar brick and stone suddenly hostile. The Thorne and Sterling offices were on the 40th floor of a glass tower that scraped the sky. The receptionist, a young woman with a professionally sympathetic smile, told me Mr. Thorne was in a meeting. I told her I would wait. I sat on a hard leather couch for 3 hours, watching the silent ballet of wealth management play out around me. Young men in sharp suits strode by, speaking in acronyms, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. Finally, a door opened and Julian emerged, laughing with a client. When he saw me, his smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place, brighter than ever. "Arthur! What a surprise! You should have called." He led me into his office, a corner suite with a panoramic view of Boston Harbor. The place smelled of money and lemon-scented wood polish. He closed the heavy glass door behind us, and the symphony of the office was silenced. "What's on your mind?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit. I couldn't speak. I just pointed a shaking finger toward the harbor, toward the life I was supposed to have. "My account, Julian. It's empty." He let out a sigh, the performance beginning. He sat down opposite me, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Arthur, I'm so sorry. I was going to call you today. We need to talk about Viridian dynamics." Viridian dynamics. I'd never heard of it. He explained, in a torrent of financial jargon, that it was a disruptive tech startup with paradigm-shifting potential. He said he'd moved a significant portion of my portfolio into it, believing it was the next big thing. And then, overnight, the company had collapsed. A catastrophic failure. A total loss. "But I never authorized that," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "A high-risk tech startup?" "We agreed, Julian. Conservative investments. Blue-chip stocks. Bonds." He leaned forward and steepled his fingers, his expression shifting from sympathy to a kind of gentle pity that was infinitely more cruel. "Arthur, you signed off on it. You gave me discretionary authority for aggressive growth strategies. We discussed the risk-reward profile." "No," I said, my voice rising. "No, we did not." He sighed again, as if dealing with a confused child. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a file. From it, he produced a document, sliding it across the polished surface towards me. "Your signature, Arthur." I looked down. It was a trading authorization form, dated 6 months prior. It was filled with language I didn't understand, giving him sweeping powers to invest in high-risk, speculative ventures. And at the bottom, there it was. My signature. Or a flawless forgery of it. It was my name, in my hand, but it was a lie. I felt the world tilt on its axis. He had planned this. Every charming lunch, every reassuring phone call, it was all a prelude to this moment. He had drained my life's work into a phantom company, a black hole designed to make my money disappear, and he had created a paper trail that made me complicit in my own ruin. "I never signed this," I said, my voice hoarse. He just looked at me, that pitying smile still playing on his lips. "I understand this is a shock," he said softly. The door to his office opened, and his assistant peeked in. "Mr. Thorne, your 2 o'clock is here." Julian stood up, the meeting clearly over. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of false comfort that felt like a brand. "We'll get through this, Arthur." He walked me to the door, a predator leading his victim out of the lair. As the heavy door clicked shut behind me, leaving me alone in the silent, opulent hallway, I finally understood. It wasn't about a bad investment. It was theft, executed with a surgeon's precision and a sociopath's smile. I was 66 years old, and I had absolutely nothing. The silence of that hallway was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The weeks that followed were a blur of shame and suffocating despair. The first casualty was the house. My beautiful Beacon Hill brownstone, with its worn oriental rugs and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the home where Eleanor and I had raised our daughter, where every corner held a memory, I had to sell it. The closing was a sterile, impersonal affair in a lawyer's office in downtown Crossing. I signed the papers, handed over the keys, and walked away from my own life, carrying only 2 suitcases and a box of old photographs. My new home was a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, in a grim brick building that smelled of damp concrete and boiled cabbage. The windows overlooked a rattling elevated train line that shook the thin walls every 15 minutes. Every night, the screech of steel on steel was a reminder of how far I had fallen. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd lie awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, the scene in Julian's office playing on a loop in my mind, the forged document, his pitying smile, the silent, panoramic view of a city that no longer felt like mine. I did what anyone would do. I sought legal help. I met with 3 different lawyers, each in a progressively smaller and more cluttered office. I'd sit across from them, a hopeful, desperate old man, and tell my story. They would listen patiently, nodding, taking notes. Then I'd show them a copy of the trading authorization form Julian's assistant had so kindly emailed me. They would study it, their expressions shifting from interest to professional regret. The verdict was always the same. The signature is the problem, Mr. Finch. It's a very strong document. Without proof of forgery, which is incredibly difficult and expensive to establish, your word against his, it's a non-starter. They spoke of Julian's reputation, his firm's high-powered legal team, and the prohibitive cost of a lawsuit I had no chance of winning. Each consultation ended with a sympathetic handshake and the crushing finality of a closed door. I was legally trapped, branded a fool who had gambled away his future. My former colleagues from Boston Latin would call, their voices thick with pity. The story had spread. Kind old Arthur Finch lost his mind in his retirement, got greedy, and lost everything. The humiliation was a constant, physical weight. Julian had not only stolen my money, he had stolen my dignity, my reputation, my past. It was in the depths of that bleak apartment, surrounded by boxes I couldn't bring myself to unpack, that the historian in me began to stir. Despair is a fog, but eventually, your eyes adjust. You start to see shapes in the gloom. My mind, trained for decades to sift through details, to find the truth in primary sources, began to latch onto the inconsistencies, the tiny details that felt wrong. It started with a pen. I remembered vividly the day I signed the initial, legitimate account opening documents in Julian's office. He had handed me his pen. It was a Mont Blanc Legrand, a thick, black cigar of a pen with a gold nib. He'd made a small comment about it, something like, an instrument for important decisions. It was part of his stagecraft, his performance of old-world quality and trustworthiness. I remembered the smooth, wet flow of the ink, the satisfying heft of it in my hand. But as I stared at the digital copy of the forgery on my laptop screen, zooming in until the pixels blurred, the signature looked different. It was my handwriting, yes, but it lacked the confidence of the original. The ink flow seemed thinner, more uniform, as if from a lesser pen. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw, the kind of detail a forger might miss but a man obsessed with the authenticity of his own life would notice. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first loose thread. I stopped trying to sleep and started to work. My new office was a corral in the back of the Boston Public Library at Copley Square. I became a ghost in its halls, arriving when the doors opened and leaving only when the security guards made their final rounds. I surrounded myself with the smell of old paper and the comforting silence of shared knowledge. My first subject was the phantom company, Viridian Dynamics. I spent weeks searching corporate databases, news archives, and investment forums. I found nothing. There were no press releases, no patents, no employee profiles. The company had a registered address, a P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware, the epicenter of anonymous shell corporations. It had been incorporated 7 months ago and dissolved 2 weeks ago, just after my money had vanished. It was a ghost, a purpose-built vessel for my stolen pension. This was the first piece of concrete proof. This wasn't a failed investment, it was a deliberate, meticulously planned heist. My anger, which had been a dull, throbbing ache, began to sharpen into a fine, cold point. The library became my sanctuary and my armory. I taught myself skills I never knew I needed. I read books on forensic accounting, on corporate law, on digital forensics. I became fluent in the language of my enemy. I was no longer a victim, I was a researcher, and Julian Thorne was my subject. One rainy Thursday, I was sifting through old emails, looking for any correspondence with Julian. I found one from 2 years ago, a simple confirmation of a change of address for my statements. Attached was a scanned PDF of the form I'd had to sign. It was a trivial document, forgotten as soon as it was sent. But now, it was a Rosetta Stone. On my laptop, I opened the PDF of this old, legitimate signature and the PDF of the forgery. I placed them side by side, zooming in, comparing the loops of the cross of the T in Arthur. The forgery was good, a masterful piece of work, but it was a copy. It lacked the natural, fluid pressure of a real signature. But the damning piece of evidence wasn't in the image itself. It was hidden in the code. I had read about metadata, the digital fingerprint that every file carries. Following instructions from an online forum, I found a way to view the full properties of the forged PDF that Julian's office had sent me. A window popped up, filled with technical data. And there it was. Under details, a line of text that made my breath catch in my chest. Date created, April 12th, 2:15 p.m. April 12th. The document was dated July 20th, the day I had supposedly signed it in a fit of reckless gambling. The digital file had been created, the forgery presumably embedded in it, more than 3 months before I was alleged to have ever laid eyes on it. It was the digital equivalent of a killer dropping the murder weapon at the scene of the crime before the victim had even arrived. I had him. I had the proof. Or so I thought. The metadata was a crack in Julian's armor, but I knew it wasn't enough to bring him down. A high-priced lawyer would dismiss it as a clerical error, a simple mistake made by an assistant. They would create doubt, and in the world of law, doubt is a fortress for the guilty. I needed more. I needed to understand the man, not just the crime. To defeat an empire, you must first understand its emperor. My research shifted from Julian's methods to Julian himself. And the world showed me an emperor in his prime. He was everywhere. A feature in Boston Magazine's Power Players Under 40, leaning against the railing of a yacht in the seaport, his hair perfectly tousled by the sea breeze. A photograph in the society pages of the Boston Globe, smiling at a charity gala, his arm around a state senator. His name was on a bronze plaque in the lobby of the Museum of Fine Arts, a testament to his generous patronage. He was building a dynasty, brick by gilded brick. He had constructed an image of himself as a pillar of Boston society, young, brilliant, philanthropic. Untouchable. Against this gleaming facade, I was a ghost. A forgotten, slightly senile old teacher who had made a bad bet. He had all the power, all the credibility. My single piece of digital evidence felt like a pea shooter against a tank. The weight of his power was crushing. For days, I fell back into the fog. What could one old man in a shabby apartment do against a prince of the city? I would walk the streets of Boston, the city of my birth, and see his name, his face, his influence everywhere. He had not only taken my home, he had taken my city. The turning point came on a miserable Tuesday in late November. A cold, relentless rain was lashing against my apartment window, mirroring the storm inside me. I was sitting in my worn armchair, looking at the only photograph I had displayed, a picture of Eleanor and me, taken on the public garden swan boats 20 years earlier. Her smile was radiant, full of the easy joy she brought to everything. We had built a life on simple, solid things, honesty, hard work, patience. We had trusted the world to be, if not fair, at least rational. Julian had shattered that world. He had used trust as a weapon and my life's work as raw material for his own ascent. Looking at Eleanor's smiling face, a different kind of anger began to burn away the despair. It wasn't the hot, helpless rage of a victim anymore. It was a cold, quiet fury. A historian's fury. I had spent my life teaching students about the fall of Rome, the hubris of Napoleon, the intricate webs of consequence that bring down the powerful. The lesson was always the same: empires don't collapse from a single, mighty blow. They rot from within. They are undone by their own arrogance, their own excesses, their own blind spots. Julian saw me as weak, forgettable, defeated. A foolish old man. And in that moment, I resolved to become exactly what he thought I was. I would be the quiet, unassuming, harmless old man. But beneath that cloak of invisibility, I would become a scholar of his destruction. My objective was no longer just to get my money back. That was a consequence, not a goal. My goal was to meticulously, patiently, and completely dismantle the empire of Julian Thorne. I would use his own strengths, his ambition, his arrogance, his desperate need for social validation, as the very tools of his undoing. It would not be a war of lawyers and lawsuits. It would be a war of whispers, of details, of perception. A war fought from the shadows, with the patience of a historian examining a forgotten text for its hidden meaning. I stood up and walked to the small kitchenette. In a dusty jewelry box, there was one last thing of value I owned, Eleanor's diamond necklace, the one I'd given her for our 25th anniversary. I had kept it, unable to part with the memory. Now, it had a new purpose. The next day, I sold it to a dealer in the jeweler's building on Washington Street. The $4,000 felt like the seed money for a revolution. I went to a payphone, I didn't trust my own cell anymore, and made a call. I had a name, given to me by one of the lawyers I had seen, a name he'd mentioned in passing as someone who operated in the gray areas. His name was Frank Rizzo, a former Boston police detective turned private investigator. When he answered, his voice was gravelly, impatient. "Rizzo." "My name is Arthur Finch," I said, my voice steady. "I need to hire you. I want you to investigate a man named Julian Thorne." There was a pause. "What for? Cheating on his wife?" "No," I said, looking out the payphone's smudged glass at the bustling street. "I don't want to know who he's sleeping with. I don't care about his vices. I want you to find out what he loves. I want to know what he cherishes more than money." Frank Rizzo operated out of a small, dusty office above a cannoli shop in the North End. He was a man in his late 50s with tired eyes, a rumpled suit, and the profound cynicism of someone who had seen the worst of people for a living. He listened to my story without interruption, his face impassive. When I finished, he took a long sip of his cold coffee. "So, the pretty boy Financier took you for a ride," he grunted. "Happens every day. You want my advice? Let it go. You can't win." "I'm not trying to win in court," I replied. "I'm trying to understand his vulnerabilities." He studied me for a long moment, a flicker of something, maybe curiosity, maybe pity, in his eyes. "Find out what he loves," he repeated my words, a wry smile touching his lips. "All right, Professor. It's your money." For the next 2 weeks, I waited. I returned to my routine at the library, but my research had a new focus. I was studying the art of the long con, the strategies of psychological warfare. I read about honey traps and Trojan horses, not as ancient history, but as practical manuals. Frank's report, when it came, was a thin manila folder that felt impossibly heavy. It contained a few grainy surveillance photos and 5 pages of single-spaced text. The report confirmed Julian was clean in the traditional sense. No gambling addiction, no secret drug habit, no messy affairs. He was disciplined, controlled. But Frank had found the crack in his armor. Julian had one all-consuming passion, a desperate craving that went beyond mere hobby. He was a collector of rare, vintage watches. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the story, the legacy. He was a new money shark desperately trying to buy the skin of old money aristocracy. He saw these timepieces, with their decades of history ticking on the wrists of kings and captains of industry, as a way to purchase the one thing his stolen money couldn't buy him, a pedigree. Frank's report detailed every known watch in his collection and, crucially, the one he was hunting for. His grail. A Patek Philippe reference 1518 in steel. It was one of only 4 known to exist, a legend among collectors. It was the ultimate symbol of taste, history, and exclusivity. Frank had also uncovered Julian's other great ambition. He was angling for a seat on the board of the Boston Children's Foundation, one of the city's oldest and most respected charities. A board seat was the ultimate stamp of approval from the Brahmin establishment he so desperately wanted to join. With this knowledge, my plan began to take shape. It would be a two-pronged assault, targeting both of his great loves, his desire for a manufactured legacy and his need for social acceptance. First, the watch. I spent a week crafting a new identity. With a burner email address and a sophisticated VPN to hide my location, I became Herr Müller, a reclusive, elderly German watch collector living in a small village in the Alps. Herr Müller had inherited a magnificent collection and was now, in his twilight years, looking to pass his treasures on to a true connoisseur. His prized possession? A pristine, steel Patek Philippe 1518. I joined the exclusive online forums where men like Julian boasted about their collections. I lurked for days, learning the language, the etiquette. Then, Herr Müller made his first, quiet post, a blurry photograph of the watch, its legendary face partially obscured by shadow. Considering parting with an old family friend, the message read, "For a private, discerning buyer only." It took less than an hour for Julian, under a pseudonym I had already identified from French Report, to send a private message. The fish had taken the bait. I began a slow, methodical correspondence with him, drawing out the process over weeks. I was aloof, slightly eccentric, playing hard to get. The more I held back, the more desperate and aggressive Julian became. He was so blinded by his desire for this ultimate status symbol that he never once questioned the setup. While Herr Müller was reeling in Julian online, Arthur Finch was beginning the second phase of the attack. I went to the Boston Children's Foundation and signed up to be a volunteer. I was just another retiree looking to fill my days. I was given the most menial of tasks, stuffing envelopes, making coffee, arranging chairs for meetings. I was quiet, polite, and completely invisible. The staff saw me as a sweet, harmless old man. I faded into the background, and from there, I watched. I listened. I learned the ecosystem of the foundation. I identified the key players, the internal politics, the gossip. And at the top of the food chain was the formidable board chairwoman, Eleanor Vance. She was in her late 70s, a true Boston Brahmin with a razor-sharp mind and a reputation for valuing integrity above all else. She was the gatekeeper. Julian's charm would not work on her, only true character would pass her muster. I knew I could never match his donations, but I could give her something more valuable, the truth. My life as a ghost had begun. I was playing two roles, a wealthy European sophisticate and a poor, anonymous volunteer. One was baiting a trap in the digital world, the other was quietly laying the groundwork in the real one. Julian had no idea that the man whose life he had destroyed was now closing in on him from two different directions, a pincer movement aimed directly at the heart of his fragile ego. The online negotiation for the watch reached its climax. I, as Herr Müller, finally agreed to sell. The price was astronomical, $800,000. Julian didn't even blink. But then came the hook. I explained that, due to complex European inheritance laws and a desire to minimize taxes, the payment had to be structured in a very specific, unusual way. It would require him to wire the money in 4 separate, untraceable transactions to a series of offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. It was a textbook money laundering scheme. Any legitimate banker would have run for the hills. But Julian wasn't a banker, he was a thief, and his greed was a roaring fire that consumed all caution. He agreed. He was so close to owning his grail, to cementing his legacy, that he would do whatever it took. A few days later, I received a notification from the encrypted email account. The first wire transfer had been initiated. The first bar of Julian's prison had just been forged. The money started moving. Through the labyrinth of shell corporations and anonymous accounts Frank had helped me set up, Julian's stolen wealth began its journey. Each transaction was a digital breadcrumb, a permanent, glaring red flag on the international banking system's radar. I wasn't just setting a trap for Julian, I was building a cage for him, and he was willingly, eagerly, handing me the steel to build it. While he was busy wiring away his future, I was making myself indispensable at the Boston Children's Foundation. I was always the first to arrive, the last to leave. I learned the names of everyone, from the janitor to the CEO. I was Arthur, the quiet, reliable volunteer who always had a kind word. My moment came during the frantic preparations for the annual fundraising luncheon. I saw Eleanor Vance, the board chairwoman, looking exhausted and overwhelmed by a seating chart crisis. The other staff members were scared of her, keeping their distance. I waited for a quiet moment and approached her, not with a problem, but with a piece of her own history. "Mrs. Vance," I said softly, "forgive me for interrupting. I just wanted to say, I was always a great admirer of your late husband. I attended a lecture he gave at the Historical Society years ago on the maritime trade of colonial Boston. It was magnificent." Her head snapped up, her tired eyes suddenly sharp, focused. She looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time. "You knew my Charles?" she asked, a hint of warmth in her voice. "Only from his work," I said honestly. "He had a gift for making the past feel alive." We spoke for a few minutes about her husband, about Boston history, about the changing city. I didn't mention Julian Thorne. I didn't mention my situation. I just established a small, genuine connection based on shared respect for the past. I had planted a flag. I was no longer just a volunteer, I was the nice man who remembered her husband. I let that connection lie fallow for a week before making my next move. At the luncheon itself, I saw another opportunity. I was helping to direct guests to their tables when I saw Mrs. Vance speaking with a group of donors. I waited until she was alone for a moment, fetching a glass of water. I approached her again, my expression one of weary reluctance. "It's so wonderful to see all this generosity," I began, my voice quiet and full of feigned admiration. "And to see vibrant young men like Mr. Thorne becoming pillars of the community." I paused, letting his name hang in the air. In my day, finance was a much more patient affair. It's all so fast now. I shook my head slightly, a sad, bewildered smile on my face. I confess, my own experience with modern finance was quite bewildering. I lost everything. I didn't elaborate. I didn't accuse. I just dropped that single, devastating sentence and let it do its work. I saw a flicker of concern, of sharp-eyed curiosity, in her eyes. I had planted the seed of doubt. A woman like Eleanor Vance, who had spent a lifetime judging character, would not be able to ignore it. She looked at me, this quiet, dignified, and clearly broken man, and she looked over at Julian Thorne, holding court at a VIP table, laughing too loudly, his charisma suddenly looking predatory. She didn't know the story, but she could now sense that a story existed. That night, I got a call from Frank. He sounded different. There was a note of grudging respect in his gravelly voice. "The final transfer went through. 800 grand is sitting in a bank in Nevis." For a moment, my heart pounded. I could take the money. I could disappear. It was more than half of what he'd stolen. But I didn't want the money. I wanted justice. "He doesn't have the watch, does he?" I asked. "Nope," Frank said. "Your Hermuller has gone dark. The email account is deleted. Julian is out to cash with nothing to show for it. He can't report it stolen without admitting to a series of felonies." I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. The trap was sprung. But it was the second part of Frank's news that made my blood run cold with triumph. "I made the call," he said. "An anonymous tip to a friend of a friend at the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I gave them the wire transfer numbers, the offshore accounts. I told them to look into a Boston financier who seems to be an expert at moving large, untraceable sums of money. They're officially looking at him, Arthur. The clock is ticking." Julian was now being squeezed from two sides. His desire for the watch had made him a criminal, and his need for social acceptance had put him under the microscope of a formidable woman. He was a man in a soundproof room, unaware that the walls were slowly, silently closing in. The first tremor Julian felt was not from the government, but from within his own firm. An official inquiry from Financier, no matter how preliminary, triggers internal alarms. Thorne and Sterling initiated a mandatory internal audit of Julian's accounts. His partners, men who had profited from his aggressive style, now saw him as a liability. The whispers started in the hallways I had once walked. The feds were sniffing around. Julian's flashy lifestyle, once a sign of success, now looked like evidence of recklessness. His colleagues began to distance themselves, their smiles becoming strained, their lunches with him ceasing. He was being isolated on his own 40th floor island. While the financial walls were closing in, I began to work on the social ones. The time for subtlety was over. It was time to give Mrs. Vance the ammunition she needed. I went to a copy shop in Cambridge and printed out my entire investigation. The history of the Phantom Corporation, Viridian Dynamics. The list Frank had compiled of 6 other elderly clients of Julian's whose portfolios had been inexplicably wiped out by similar high-risk, single-stock investments. And a printout of the forged trading document, with a clear, simple explanation of how the PDF's metadata proved it was created months before I supposedly signed it. I placed everything onto a single, anonymous USB drive. I put the drive in a simple padded envelope and mailed it to Mrs. Vance's home address on Beacon Hill. There was no note, no explanation. Just the cold, hard, verifiable facts. I knew a woman like her would not be able to resist a mystery, and once she looked, the truth would be undeniable. I was giving her the power to become the agent of Julian's social destruction. My next step was to awaken the other victims. I called each of the 6 people on Frank's list. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine. Confusion, shame, and the resigned helplessness of being told they had no legal recourse. I didn't ask them to join a lawsuit. I didn't ask for anything. I simply told them my story and shared my evidence. Then I gave them the final, crucial piece of information. I told them that Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the unimpeachable chairwoman of the Boston Children's Foundation, was now in possession of this same evidence. I wasn't creating an army, I was lighting a series of fuses, empowering these forgotten victims to find their own voices. The most satisfying blow came from an unexpected direction. As a final, arrogant display of his victory, Julian had bought my Beacon Hill brownstone. He had paid cash, a trophy to remind himself of the old man he had conquered. But Beacon Hill is a small, insular world, a village within a city. Reputations are everything. 1 week after I mailed the USB drive, I received a certified letter, forwarded from my old address. It was from the condominium board of the brownstone. It was a formal letter of censure against the new owner, Mr. Julian Thorne, for conduct unbecoming of a resident. Several neighbors had filed formal complaints about his loud parties, his arrogant demeanor. But the final line of the letter was the sweetest sentence I had ever read. This action was initiated following a formal petition by Mrs. Eleanor Vance, whose residence is 2 doors down. She had started her war. She wasn't just working to keep him off her charity board, she was working to expel him from the very neighborhood he had stolen his way into. He had taken my home, and now, my home was rejecting him. The beautiful, historic brick facade was becoming a prison of his own making. He was being ostracized, the ultimate punishment in the world he so desperately wanted to inhabit. The annual Boston Children's Foundation Gala was a week away. It was the event where Julian, through his massive donations, fully expected to be named the newest member of the board. It was meant to be the coronation of his arrival into Boston's elite. I knew it would be his execution. The night before the gala, I sat in my small apartment, the elevated train rattling my window. I had done all I could. I had been a ghost, a whisperer, a patient historian arranging facts. Now, the forces I had set in motion would converge, and history would run its course. The night of the gala was crisp and clear. The Boston Public Library, a magnificent palace of knowledge, was lit up, its grand arches casting long shadows on Copley Square. Limousines lined the curb, spilling out Boston's elite in a wave of silk and jewels. I wasn't on the guest list. I stood across the street, a forgotten old man in a worn overcoat, hidden in the shadows of Trinity Church. I watched as Julian Thorne arrived. He stepped out of a black town car looking like a king, his tuxedo perfect, his smile radiating a confidence that was about to be utterly extinguished. He thought this was his coronation. He had no idea he was walking to his own guillotine. From my vantage point, I saw the other guests arrive. I saw the faces of the other victims I had called, no longer looking beaten, but filled with a quiet, nervous resolve. And I saw Mrs. Vance, who walked up the grand staircase with the regal bearing of a hanging judge. I stayed outside, a spectator at my own quiet masterpiece of revenge. An hour into the event, Frank sent me a text. It's starting. Inside, in the soaring, book-lined expanse of Bates Hall, Mrs. Vance took the stage. A hush fell over the crowd. Julian was seated at a table near the front, beaming, ready for his moment of glory. According to Frank, who was inside posing as a waiter, Mrs. Vance began her speech not by celebrating a new board member, but by talking about the sacred duty of trust. She spoke of the Foundation's commitment to protecting the city's most vulnerable. This duty of care, she said, her voice ringing with authority, does not only apply to children. It applies also to our elders, who have spent their lives building this community and deserve to live their final years in dignity and security. She then announced that the Foundation was launching a bold new initiative, the Senior Guardian Fund, a pro bono legal service dedicated to fighting financial fraud against the elderly. A wave of applause rippled through the hall. Julian, confused, clapped along. This fund, Mrs. Vance continued, her eyes sweeping the room, is being seeded tonight by a significant anonymous donation. And I can announce that its first official action will be to file a class action lawsuit against Thorne and Sterling Capital and its principal partner, Mr. Julian Thorne. The silence in the hall was absolute, a vacuum where all the air and chatter had been. Then, as if on cue, one of the victims I had called, a frail-looking woman in her 80s, stood up from her table. Then another, a retired fire captain. Then another, and another, until 6 elderly, dignified people were standing in silent accusation. The press, tipped off by Frank, suddenly materialized, camera flashes erupting like machine gun fire. Julian was frozen, his face a ghastly white mask of disbelief. His firm's partners at his table were staring at him with pure, undisguised fury, seeing their life's work vaporize in a public relations holocaust. At that exact moment, 2 men in dark, conservative suits stepped quietly into the hall from a side entrance. They were calm, professional. They didn't rush. They just began to walk slowly, deliberately, toward Julian's table. They were federal agents. The final move was one I hadn't even planned. It was a gift from Julian's own bottomless greed. As he sat there, paralyzed, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a text message from his bank's international fraud department. The message, which Frank later relayed to me, informed him that the $800,000 he had wired for the Patek Philippe watch had been flagged. In the process of investigating the suspicious transaction, they had uncovered the source of the funds. In his rush, Julian hadn't used his own money. He had stolen it directly from the account of yet another elderly client, liquidating her portfolio to pay for his coveted watch. It was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. A direct line from his theft to his greed. He looked up from his phone, his eyes wide with animal panic, and saw the 2 federal agents standing beside his chair. The hunt was over. I didn't stay to watch them lead him away. That wasn't my victory. My victory was the quiet walk away from the library, melting back into the anonymity of the city. I heard the sirens in the distance, but they felt like they were for someone else, in another world. The aftermath was a firestorm. The story was on the front page of every newspaper, the lead on every local news broadcast. Financial prodigy arrested for massive elder fraud. Thorne and Sterling collapses under lawsuits and federal investigation. Julian's empire, built on lies and stolen dreams, crumbled to dust in less than a week. Facing a mountain of evidence and abandoned by everyone, he took a plea deal. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Through the class action suit and the seizure of his assets, I recovered about 80% of what he had stolen. It was more than I ever expected. But I didn't go back to Beacon Hill. I couldn't. That chapter of my life was over, the pages filled with too much pain. Instead, I bought a small, gray-shingled cottage in Truro, out on the quiet end of Cape Cod. My new neighbors are the dunes, the sea grass, and the endless sky. My days are filled with the simple, solid things Eleanor and I had always dreamed of: long walks on the beach, the smell of salt in the air, and a tower of history books by my armchair. The revenge didn't bring me joy. It didn't erase the pain or the humiliation. It simply restored a kind of balance to the universe, a sense of order. I, a historian, had simply ensured that Julian Thorne met his logical, historical end. I had used his own arrogance as the catalyst for his downfall, and in the end, he was just another footnote in a long line of powerful men who believed they were untouchable. He was a story I had researched, written, and concluded. Sometimes, when the tide is out and the flats stretch for a mile toward the horizon, I find old, forgotten things washed up on the shore, a piece of sea glass worn smooth by the waves, a gnarled piece of driftwood, a broken shell. I pick them up, feel their history, and remember that the ocean, like time, eventually grinds down even the hardest of things, and history, in the end, always buries the things that don't deserve to last. The end.